The number one complaint I hear about Squarespace is that there is no way to design for tablet. And that's actually not exactly true, because Squarespace is actually designed in order to give you the flexibility to show the same content and the same layout across everything from tablet size and up to 3000 pixels, which basically covers TVs, really large monitors for your computer, all the way down to like iPad minis and other smaller tablet sizes. So it's not that you don't have control to adjust your screen. It does that for you. What you don't understand is how it's actually doing that and the tips and tricks that help make this process a little bit more comfortable and kind of predictable, so that when you're laying out in the section, you know what it's going to do on smaller screen sizes. So today I want to walk through the 4 or 5 major tips and the difference between Squarespace and Showit. So stick around. We're going to dive into how I design websites and edit them on Squarespace to make sure that the content stays usable, legible, and pretty on all the sizes. And yes, there's a little bit of compromise in there, but that kind of comes with everything that's good, right? It's not all pros and it's not all cons. So just keep that in mind and be a little bit flexible. And when we dive in and go through the details, you can follow along with me and keep these little tips in your back pocket for when you design your own website. If we haven't met before, my name is Caitlin. I run Launch the Damn Thing, and I know a thing or 5 about web design and graphic design in general. So that's why I'm qualified here to talk to you on this topic today. Now, let's dive in, and I'm going to show you all of my favorite tips and tricks to make sure that your website doesn't suck on the smaller screen sizes. Let's look. The first thing I want to talk about is making sure that you're keeping text that's near each other in the same container. So if you have a heading, what I don't want you to do is have a heading in one text box and a paragraph in a separate text box and then have them next to each other. It's just too easy on smaller screens as the layout compresses for them to accidentally overlap each other if you don't know how Fluid Engine's mobile responsive behavior works. And that's what we're here to look at today. But the easiest way to work around this is that when they're next to each other, put them in the same text box. One and done, solves your problem. You don't even have to understand how Fluid Engine works in order to get that to work in your favor. So that's option number 1. Just to show you an example of the opposite behavior of this, we would have text in one block and paragraph in another. The reason this is hard to manage is because, let's turn this background off and that background off, is because if you don't resize the text box, and let's say that's too far apart from each other, if I turn the grid on by pressing G on my keyboard, you can see that this header is taking up 2 rows in the grid, and this one is taking up only 1 at the moment. I can resize the box to a point in either, but it will depend on the size of the font inside. That's why you can't make this box any smaller. When I try, you can see the red line across the bottom that indicates this is the smallest height that this box can be. So you might think all you have to do is to drag this up, and now they're close enough to each other that this could actually work. The problem is this box set, both of them, are actually only taking up a percentage of the grid. So if we look at this all the way across, there's 24 columns, 24 cells across, and this is only taking up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cells of the 24. So that is a percentage, 9 out of 24. When we scale it down, you start to see how this behaves, right? The text in the top, because scale text is not on, and we'll cover that later, it is wrapping the text into multiple lines in order to fit all of the sentence inside the container. And so it makes the container larger. It's still only taking up 2 cells, but the second, 2 rows, but the second row is expanding in order to accommodate and have that extra space. The problem is the other paragraph is not also doing that. It is retaining its 1 row, just like it was before. And now you can't read either of them because they are on top of each other. So to keep from having that problem, the easiest thing to do is going to make sure that you put both in the same text box. That's the easiest way to get around it. The second thing that I kind of already hinted at is that the size of your container matters. So this is where the joke comes in. Yes, I know how that sounds. Size matters in Fluid Engine. Because this is a responsive layout, it is going to literally adapt and fluctuate based on the device's screen size. What I'm using right now is a 4K monitor that's about 30 something inches wide, and that's pretty big. That's why the cells in this grid are pretty big on the screen. But like I said before, this box is only taking up 9 out of those 24 columns. If I expand that maybe to half, now it's taking up 12 out of the 24 columns. This is taking up 50%. This is why I'm doing this, because math. I'm an art major, not a math major. So if I take up 12 of the 24 columns, that is 50% of the screen size. And if I do half of 12, that is 6 columns, that is 25% of the screen size. And the problem is not when I'm looking at it on this screen size. The problem comes when you are looking at it on smaller screen sizes. So if I resize this window and start to approach smaller screen sizes, like maybe this could be iPad Pro size, maybe this could be MacBook Air size, Surface Pro, something like that. We start to resize, it's still only taking up 25% of the screen, which means your layout's going to fluctuate because it is trying to maintain that percentage and the layout you told it you wanted. And sometimes that doesn't actually equate in the way that you expect. So when I say that size matters, I mean the container of the block needs to be something in which can fluctuate on smaller screen sizes and not look ridiculous. So wherever possible, you need to make the box that your stuff is in, whether it's a button, an image, a text block, it doesn't matter. It needs to be a big enough percentage of the overall width of the grid that on smaller screens, when it is still only that percentage, it's not going to look stupid. So let's look at an example of that. If we expand the screen again, you know what it looks like at 6, but let's say we just wanted a super quick, super simple button text situation, and we wanted this to take up the majority of the screen. Let's say it was some texture or something that actually warranted taking up so much of the screen. If we leave this the way that it is, let's act that paragraph too, so it's a bit larger. And so if you line the content to the center, and now we're only taking up 3 of the 24 columns, then it's an interesting layout on desktop. But if we look at it on smaller tablet size screens, that is truly unreadable. You do not want the layout to turn into that. So you just want to be extremely cognizant of how much percentage width across the screen your stuff is taking up, because that matters for your size device and smaller. So first we looked at making sure that text, headings, and paragraphs are, when they're next to each other, right up against each other. They need to be in the same text box just to make your life easier. The second thing is that the container size matters. Let's also look at the way that buttons behave because of this, the same example. So if we look at a button, for example, this just says join now, but let's do what I do not suggest and make it a long button title. Join now for exclusive access. Okay, so let's pretend that's what we want the button to say. Again, if this button is only taking up 4 of the 24 columns, it is only taking up a percentage of how big it can actually get. And so on smaller screens, if we switch over to the mobile view, that button is still only taking up a portion of the screen. And in between, from desktop and tablet sizes, it's going to fluctuate even more. So if you have a long title on your button, thankfully in mobile view, you can expand that. That's still as much as you can get it. It's still going to wrap into 2 lines because the text is not getting smaller, but there's a lot of it to fit into a small space. So if we switch back to desktop here, how we're going to get around this, if you want the button to have a long text title on it and you want it to take up a smaller amount of space, the easiest thing to do is going to be to go to the button settings, go under design, and switch the button to fit. This is going to fit the button within the container. So the trick here is to make the container bigger than you need it to be. And now, because the button is set to fit rather than fill, it's not going to fill the entire container. It's only going to fit the text, the button visual, the button shape to the text, however long the text actually is. And so now if we resize the screen, it takes a lot more before that button will actually wrap. So this is about the smallest the grid will stay before it switches over to mobile. And you can watch it do that as I continue to resize, getting closer. Okay, now we've switched to the mobile grid. Now we're on the desktop grid. Did you see the difference there? So even as small as this, that button text is not going to wrap because we've given it all this extra space to the right and the left, and that button shape can take up as much of the width as it needs, so that text doesn't need multiple lines. So to recap, make sure your shapes can be as big as they can in order to prevent excessive wrapping that's in a text box, on a button, whatever. But if you can make the container bigger than you actually need it to be, often you can switch what's inside the formatting from fit to fill for buttons, or just make sure that you're really cognizant of how big the text box is so that when it resizes on smaller screens, you know how it's going to wrap and how it's going to behave and adjust. The next thing that I want to talk about is the scale text feature, because this can actually help with mobile, but you do have to understand how it works in order to use it correctly. So let's say that we want this heading to be really large. If we make scale text, or if we turn scale text on, as we discussed in the previous video where I talk about this feature in a little bit more depth, it's going to actually scale the text to fit the width of the container, which means you can actually go all the way to the edge and make this text as big as it can possibly be on this size screen. It is literally going from edge to edge. If you do that though, what you'll notice on the mobile view is that it's not really that big. And what it's doing is it's actually fitting the text inside of the container in the same way. But the problem is on mobile view, you only have 8 columns across, not 24. There's just not enough screen real estate in order to provide you with 24 column grid. So that text is pretty small, and maybe you want it to wrap on mobile but not on desktop. Therein lies a problem. You can't actually do that without having separate box. So what I suggest, number one, you can try to make the heading text actually shorter. So change what it says and get a smaller word count, because the less words you have going from left to right across the full width of the container, the bigger the letters can be. The more you have, the smaller they will be because it has to fit more in the width of the container. But there is a workaround. So if you don't want to do that, if I force a break by doing Shift plus Enter on my keyboard, there is one line space in between this. This is not 2 different paragraphs. This is actually a forced break in one paragraph. So it's a single space rather than a double space. If you do that and then you select all of it and then turn the scale text on, it's going to scale both rows of text at the same size. So you can still make the text really large. The text can be a lot larger because you're not limited to the size that it would be if the text box is going all the way across the screen and fitting in all of the letters. Now you're allowing it to split it up into 2 pieces basically, and they can get a lot bigger. Now, if you look at the mobile view of this, the text is a lot bigger because we've forced a split. So both lines have the same size up. They're both being scaled up at the same rate. Both lines of text are the same font size, and you can control that on mobile with the size of the box a little bit better. So it may not have the same effect as the text going all the way across. Let's turn this grid off so we can focus. Pressing G on my keyboard again. And let's bring that button back up underneath and let's resize the section a bit so you can see how that would actually look. There we go. So now we have the button container as big as it can be so that that long button text is not going to wrap into 2 lines, even in smaller screens. And we also have more control because when we turn scale text on, it is a responsive font size. It's going to recalculate the font size of the text inside to fit it always 100% of the width of whatever the box size is. But keep in mind, this is still a percentage of the overall grid. So if we turn the grid back on, we can see this is taking up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's it's taking up 50% of the grid, which means even when it scales down, it's still only going to take up 50%. So there's about 25% of the screen on either side. And if we resize that screen, you can see that it stays in the right proportion, but the text itself is getting smaller so that it can still maintain the calculated font size. So it's still taking up 100% of the box, but that box is only taking up 50% of the screen size width. So I hope you're following me with that. So it's a great way to get customizable sizes for your headings without actually having to mess with site styles, because that is a global change, whereas this is a block-specific change. It only affects this particular block. So the next thing I want to talk about is desktop changes versus tablet or mobile changes. Squarespace with 7.1 Fluid Engine took away our view of tablet, and everybody's upset about this, myself included. I don't love that we can't see what's going on there, but even if we could, we couldn't actually do anything specific to tablet size unless they gave us that ability. So there's lots of plugins out there, including SquareKicker and even Chris Schwartz-Edmiston's plugin that specifically gives you more tablet control, and we'll talk about that next. But essentially, you have two breakpoints. The desktop breakpoint, which goes all the way down to about 767 pixels or 749, whatever it is. It goes down to a medium-sized tablet screen. Then mobile view is the last little piece. So a wide range of mobile screen widths. The reason why we don't have control over tablet, let me just start there, is that only about 2% globally use tablet to surf the internet. It seems mind-blowing to me, but that is the statistic. There is research on this to back it up, and I will link to that research below so you can see the actual changing statistics. But it's only about 1 to 2% of your whole entire audience on the internet globally. Basically, that means almost nobody is doing this. So the fact that we don't like it is kind of irrelevant because it doesn't affect that many people. That said, just because it doesn't affect that many people does not mean that it's affecting no one. So it's important for you to know how to adjust Squarespace design layouts so that you can have less of a problem in that middle ground that you can't really control yet. So what we would like to focus on for that is desktop changes to the layout or position of your blocks is separate from the layout and position on mobile view. So what I mean by that is if you decided to change a color to the text on the inside of a text box and maybe change the alignment. So let's take the scale text feature off and do center. Let's do left align. If we decide to make the text color different, if we want to, let's see, we have a highlight here, or maybe that's just an underline. There we go. So let's do a highlight and let's make that highlight green. So we have different color customized text. We have alignment to the left for the paragraph, and we've added a highlight. All of these changes are internal. They are happening to the content on the inside of the block. And we'll notice if we switch over to mobile view, all of those are happening over here too. That's because we are affecting the inside, the content of the text box. It shows up in both places. What does not show up, let's go back here. Now, if we switch back to desktop, we're going to see all the changes that we just removed in mobile view also removed in desktop view. So again, we're changing the content of the text box, not how it sits on the page. That is what desktop versus mobile actually does. So if let's go back to scale text. If we change the layout and we put this over here and we move the button, we can probably safely do about half the screen and then align this to the left. This is not changing fit to fill. This is not changing the text on the button. This is not changing the link to the button. It's just changing the placement of the button within the container. And that is different than aligning text in the paragraph. So I'll try to cover that again in a second, but we're just changing the position. If we go back over to mobile here, we'll notice that this is aligned to the left and it is still centered. So it's doing the same thing that it would be doing on desktop, and we can move this wherever we'll be able to read it the best. So The thing that does seem to transfer over with fit buttons specifically, you notice the alignment, it's still left aligned in mobile view, and that's because we are aligning content on the inside of the container. So if I change it to centered and I switch back to desktop, now the button is centered in both places. The workaround for that is to switch the button to fill instead of fit, but that will make it very, very large, and most people do not like the look of that. So if we switch back to mobile view, you can see the difference. I could choose to make the button a bit smaller and force it to wrap however I want. So that would be tolerable. The button is large, but that's okay if that's the main call to action in that section, as opposed to this, which I would want to be centered on mobile but left aligned on desktop. That's the kind of compromise that you'll need to learn how to make, and kind of pre-plan that when you're designing too. That also helps. If you know this when you're designing it, then when you come back over here, you're not going to be brokenhearted because you can't get the layout that you wanted. So again, just to be super, super clear, but the difference between desktop and mobile is layout and position changes. The content within the block, the alignment vertically within the block is unique to desktop and unique to mobile when you set it. But anything that affects the actual content alignment, the content style, so if you change the heading, if you make it bold, italic, if you use any of the formatting bar on the inside of a text box, it's going to show up in mobile view. The same with buttons. If you affect the link, if you affect the style of the button, fit versus fill, if you align it horizontally, left, center, or right aligned, it's going to show up on mobile too. So that's the difference between the two editors. It will allow you to place it within the section however you need to in desktop versus mobile. And you do absolutely need to check mobile every single time you see a blue dot up there. That means that something you've done in desktop is affecting the mobile layout, and it's trying to remind you so that you don't forget, save your changes, walk away, and have it be unreadable or unusable in that section before you walk away from the project. Okay, so the last thing that I want to touch on is the plugins. SquareKicker still has 4 different views. I think it's 4 different views: desktop, small laptop, tablet, and mobile. You are able to make specific design changes in each of those views, but position and layout is not one of those options. You can technically scoot things to the left, scoot things to the right, twist them, rotate them, scale up, scale down, those kinds of things. But it's not going to give you as much control as you want, so you might as well not rely on that and just use the built-in options for Fluid Engine, because that's going to mean that you don't actually need something like SquareKicker for those changes. And also, things change and fluctuate between a vast amount of different screens, sizes, brands, whatever. And so even having those 4, which feels like a lot, is not nearly enough to cover everything in between. So just that said, using something like SquareKicker or relying on something like SquareKicker to make device-specific changes is still not the smartest move. You need to get really familiar with how Fluid Engine works first before you can start to rely on any tweaks and stuff like that. That said, now that I've been using Fluid Engine for a couple years as a posting, and I've been using SquareKicker since 2020, I know how they work, and I can trust that if I adjust the font size so that I can keep it from wrapping, I can just go down a little bit or up a little bit. That's okay. But for beginners, I say rely on Fluid Engine specifically. And once you get comfortable with that, then add on another piece if you want. That said, there is one plugin that is maybe misunderstood. I myself misunderstood it, so I can relate. And that is Chris Schwartz-Edmiston's plugin. It's free. You can download it from the Chrome store. It works in the Arc browser, which is what I'm using now. It also, of course, works in Chrome or any Chrome-based browser, I assume. All you have to do to turn it on is enable the extension. So once you have it installed, you can click on the plugin or the extension icon, and you'll get a little pop-up that asks to fix the in-between sizes and asks you to enable or disable. If you click enable, now you have a different navigation up here. It's basically added a mobile preview, which you cannot edit in. It's just for viewing only. And it's changed the device width for the Squarespace mobile editor to be tablet size. So you can see that's quite a bit wider than the Squarespace mobile preview. What you're actually doing in this case is widening the mobile preview. You still only have 8 columns, but it's widening it so that you can see where those weird spacing issues are on tablet. And you can actually adjust here and then preview only here to see how it's affecting mobile specifically. If we have this layout here, and let's play around with this a bit too. Here we have something kind of fun happening. We have a text box with a background, but we also have a shape box behind it so that we can kind of extend this background behind the image without allowing the image to ever overlap with the text. So it looks visually like they are overlapping each other, but they're actually not, which is really nice. So let's make that font a little bit bigger and let's do scale text on the heading. So now if we switch over to this view, you can see we've got a little bit of spacing issues here and a little bit of spacing issues here. So if we drag this down and drag that down, make that a little bit bigger. There we go. Let's actually make that a bit taller. Okay. So for a tablet, that's kind of totally blocking her in the background, isn't it? Let's size these down together. Not super ideal for the text to be that small, but for this example, we'll just deal with it. Put her down here. And then overlap that just a little. Oh, that's not great alignment, but we'll leave it for now. Okay, so here we have the text box. Let's find where that shape block is. There it is, right here. So the fun thing about shape blocks or Fluid Engine in general is that if you ever want to hide something that you don't want to see on mobile, you can make it one cell large and then put it behind something and you don't even have to worry about it anymore. So let's make this image big and then let's change the order. So we'll put the image on top, the text on the bottom, and the button overlapping the text here. That gets rid of all of our spacing issues. And if we switch over to mobile, it's not great. So you still have to remember that if you're using a plugin like this, you're still working with percentages on the grid. And if I'm only using 1, 2, 3, 4 across the 8, that's still 50% of the screen, which means when I change over to mobile, it's only going to be 50% of an already narrow screen. So wherever possible, you want to make sure that even when you're using a plugin like this, and even when it will allow you to remove some of the weird spacing issues, you still want to be cognizant of the text size because, again, that point is still one of the most important ones of this video. The size matters of your container in Fluid Engine. So let's take this up a notch. Let's do this big. Take this down. Let's do that much and see what that looks like instead. Much more readable. The problem still is the spacing issue, and there's some compromises you're just going to have to make. Now you can, let's save that change and exit and disable it. And now you can actually edit on mobile, but just know that if you do that, it's going to screw up any changes you made at the larger mobile size using the plugin. So now I can remove that or make it just slightly large enough to overlap the button without also overlapping the text. And now we have something that looks good on both sizes. So with his plugin specifically, I have personally found that in some situations, it's the only way to get rid of weird spacing issues. But for the majority of layouts, as long as you lay it out with that in mind, that everything that you put in a section is a percentage of the overall width of the screen for all devices and not just the one you're looking at when you're designing, then you don't always need that plugin. So I have found that I don't need it very often. There have been fewer situations where I have needed it than situations where I have. So I wouldn't download it unless just keep it kind of bookmarked maybe for access, or you can go ahead and download it. It's free. Don't have to use it. Just keep it disabled until you come across a project where you're like, oh, these spacing issues are really bothering me. That's the workaround. That's how you use it. So just keep that in mind as you're designing with Fluid Engine. And remember that all things website design is a compromise by nature. Squarespace doesn't give you pixel perfect control. And frankly, you don't really want that, to be honest. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that Squarespace is not meant to give you pixel perfect control over your design. The reason is because that is not responsive to the widest range of devices. And frankly, that is real life. We don't know what our viewers are using or going to use. There's no way to predict what they're going to use to view our content online. And so if you don't know and can't predict what they're going to use, you really have to prepare for them to be using anything from the iPhone from like 10 years ago all the way up to a television basically in their living room, right? Because that can happen. People can screencast or whatever. So you really need to be able to use anything in between. And something like Showit, who is locked into a certain set of pixels for mobile view and for desktop, and the content is not allowed to grow with the size of the screen or contract with the size of the screen like Squarespace can, you really have a lot of limitations on how the content grows and adapts. So I always know when I'm looking at a Showit website because I can tell that certain elements in the design were added to the design and locked into that space. But when the content gets just a little wider, it's out of sync and it doesn't fit where it was supposed to go and the design feels confusing. Squarespace has its pros and cons too, don't get me wrong. But what it does do really well is not give you pixel perfect control. And so the content is allowed to grow and expand to the size of the screen and also contract with smaller screens so that your content is fluid, it's adaptive, it's responsive, and that is the best combination for online web design in 2024 and onward. Because as devices continue to be added to the market, we're going to have more options. It's harder to predict now than it was 5 years ago. So the more control you have is not necessarily a good thing for design. You really need this experience for the user to be high quality and based on what they're actually using to view your content. So that's just my 2 cents. I think Squarespace does a better job of this than Showit specifically. And frankly, I don't want to be locked into a certain pixel size for my website anyway. So that's what you need to keep in mind when you design and edit your website in Squarespace. If you want more tips like these, then I suggest you like and subscribe because I release new content every single week. And if this video really helped you and you had any aha moments while you watched it, please leave a comment below and let me know what your aha moment was or how this video helped you. I'm always super curious to hear your thoughts and feedback. That's all I have for you in this video. I will catch you in the next one. Bye!